On January 3, 2026, the 3i Atlas object makes a move that breaks two traditional observational pillars at once. It moves not further, but into a geometry where even the best optical telescopes begin to see not its own limitations, but their own. On this day, no one argues about the beautiful tails and spectra. The only controversy is why he chooses the sector near Venus precisely when light pollution, phase, and angular proximity to the Sun make optics a lottery. On paper, it all looks innocent. Venus is simply bright. The Sun is simply in the way. Earth's atmosphere is simply noisy. But in real-world logs, it looks different, as if the object already knows which windows we consider best geometry, and each time it arrives at the point where best becomes impossible. The first warning signs appear not in images, but in schedules. Several observatories change their plans for the same night because the object is moving into a small elongation angle. Officially, this is a technical adjustment. In reality, it feels like capitulation. Large instruments don't like looking close to the Sun, not because they're blinded, but because they run risks. Stray light, stray reflections, detector overexposure, overheating. The world's most expensive optics can fail simply because too much bright geometry appears in the frame. And here, Venus becomes the perfect cover. It's so bright that any faint structure next to it easily fades into the background. It provides a normal explanation for any failure. It's not an object, it's Venus that's ruining it. But the object doesn't just happen to be nearby. It chooses a moment when Venus provides a convenient screen for several types of observations simultaneously. The angle is poor for long exposures. The phase is inconvenient for picking out the faint cometary cloud. And, most importantly, the public is predisposed to believe the technical explanation. Inside, they call it the excuse corridor. It's a zone of the sky where any oddity can be attributed to optics, calibration, scattering, or the atmosphere. You can disappear gracefully there, and no one will make a fuss because noise is easily explained. But there are things that don't depend on images. There are radio lines. There are precise Doppler measurements. There are dynamics that don't require whether Venus is bright nearby or not. And that's where the data that makes you uneasy begins to emerge. While the optics debate whether it's visible or not, radio networks record that the object continues to behave as if it's maneuvering rather than flying away. Small but consistent deviations in the motion pattern appear as a series of micro-corrections. If this were an ordinary icy visitor, it would float in the gravity and solar pressure, with a spread consistent with cometary physics. Here the spread looks like a handwritten note. Uniform amplitude, repeatable pattern, narrow range. The most disturbing part is that these signs appear precisely when optics lose confidence. It's as if the object divides us into two audiences. For those who see with their eyes, it leaves blind spots. For those who listen with radiometry, it leaves an all too precise trace. That same day, a simple phrase rings out on the internal call: he went under Venus. Not towards Venus, not past Venus, but precisely under, as in under a curtain, under a loud noise that closes the stage. Some try to argue that it's simply a coincidence of orbital geometry, but coincidence doesn't explain the timing well. It could have passed this sector earlier or later, and then the windows would have been better. It's choosing worse and worse precisely for us. Then the logic that's usually kept to oneself kicks in. If you want to hide from observation, you don't go far. You go to a place where the observer limits themselves, where they'll have safety rules, angle restrictions, and light exposure limits. Venus does this work for free. It forces people to turn down their ISO, shorten their shutter speeds, change filters, and abandon deep series. And every such step reduces the chances of capturing a faint structure near the subject. But it's not enough for the object to simply not see us. It makes it impossible for us to prove we don't see it. Because when the frame is bad, any attempt to say there was something else there sounds like speculation. Inside, they call it the second line of defense. Not just hiding, but hiding in such a way that any witnesses look paranoid. Because Venus is nearby. Because the Sun is nearby. Because it's normal. And then comes indirect confirmation that shouldn't have appeared at all. One of the devices, operating according to its own program and not participating in the hunt, detects an oddity in the background of the scattered light. This isn't a photograph of an object in the literal sense. It's a change in the brightness profile, resembling a fine structure intersecting the field at an unusual angle. This could be explained by dust, or it could be an artifact. But the timing coincidence negates any explanation, because at that very moment, the radiometrics show another microcorrection. It's so small, it's almost embarrassing to call it a maneuver, but it repeats the previous one. And when the repetition coincides with an indirect trace, chance becomes too convenient. The most intense part begins when someone suggests doing the opposite. Not trying to see an object near Venus, but trying to see what it does to our observation methods when it's hiding in a bright sector. That is, stop asking where is it and start asking how does it make us look. because if the choice of geometry is conscious, then it takes into account not only the orbit, but also the observer. And at this moment, a word they've been trying to avoid returns to the conversation for the first time: cover. Not inconvenient geometry, not difficult conditions, but cover, as in tactics. This version is all too human, so people usually shy away from it, but it explains everything unpleasant at once. Why he chooses Venus, why he does it after January 1st, when everyone expected him to go away, and why he continues to leave a mark on data where there's less justification. By the end of the day, one thing becomes clear: this isn't a one-night stand, it's a new regime. The object is reconfiguring its route to make the most of our own blindness without physically disappearing. And now, the question is completely different. If he chooses Venus as a cover, then what will be the next cover? The sun, the moon, radio noise, any background noise that we ourselves consider an acceptable reason for failure. The next day, the problem wasn't that he was hard to see. It was that he seemed to have deliberately chosen a place where any evidence devolves into a debate about methodology rather than facts. With Venus nearby, any trace can be dismissed as an artifact, and it's the most convenient hiding place of all. NASA launches its standard procedure: gather everything that doesn't rely on a pretty picture. Radio, Doppler, precise astrometry from short bursts, indirect measurements where the object isn't necessarily in the frame, but is required in the equations. And almost immediately, an unpleasant thing becomes clear. It doesn't get lost. It continues to behave as if it's playing with the detection threshold. Optical signals require time because the sun is nearby, because the detectors are at high risk, and because it's best not to burn out the instrument. Radio networks don't require time. They simply produce a strange pattern, small deviations that don't look like chaos from outgassing, but rather like a series of repeating clues. In a typical comet, injections create noise, scatter, and unpleasant randomness. Here, the scatter is somehow like a signature. The amplitude is constant, the direction changes within a narrow range, and most annoyingly, the periodicity is almost uniform. It doesn't scream engine, but it stubbornly refuses to be the comet's weather. While some argue, others do what they always do when their vision fails: try to detect a shadow by its effect on the background. Some are poring over archives of Venus observations from recent hours, looking not for an object, but for distortions around the bright planet, not for an image, but for statistics on noise, on the structure of scattered light, on profile shifts, and this is where the first pitfall appears. The structure in scattered light behaves as if a weak, elongated component appears in the field, not held in place by the celestial mechanics of the stars, but rather seemingly stuck to the same geometry as the object. Again, this isn't direct proof, but it's a thread that's dangerous to pull. Because if this is a real structure, it means he's not simply hiding behind Venus. It means he's using the area around it as a work zone. And a work zone next to Venus means he's not choosing a random background, but a specific background suitable for a specific task. Then begins what appears on the surface to be a tedious routine: coordinating observation windows. In practice, it's like chess, where you announce a move, but your opponent is already on a square where you can't capture. Observatories plan short series. The object remains in a sector where even short series are drowned out by light pollution. The keyword heard on the close call is simple and cold: escalation. This means activating everything that is usually only activated when the stakes are high. Not because it's scared, but because resources are limited and they can't be wasted on ordinary comets. They connect devices that don't necessarily have to be telescopes, weather satellites, ionospheric sensors, platforms that record environmental changes, not the object itself. And here a shift occurs that disrupts the usual sense of control. Some signals begin to coincide in time with the expected Earth object geometry lines, even when the object is hidden by Venusian light pollution. This isn't a planet-wide storm. These are localized bursts in the upper atmosphere, like a thin line drawn across a map, with parameters changing along it, too specific to attribute to the general background, too timely to ignore, and too inconvenient to explain publicly. Some try to maintain rationality. The upper atmosphere is alive, solar activity fluctuates, coincidences happen. But then a second question arises, one that's more poignant than the first. Why do coincidences occur where the geometry is specifically tied to the direction of the Venus sector, and not simply to latitude, time of day, or normal dynamics? At this point, a thought that would have been previously suppressed with a joke emerges in the conversation. He's not testing us, but the environment around us. Not the optics, but the entire system. If he knows how to choose geometry, what matters to him is what we see and how we react to it. And here comes an almost mundane, yet frightening analogy. If you want to understand how a building's security works, you don't enter through the main entrance with the floodlights. You go through where the cameras are blinded by the light from the display case, and you watch how people change their routes. Venus in this scheme functions as a showcase. It's so bright that the cameras themselves will be blinded, and if you observe their behavior, you get a map of limitations without firing a single shot. The question is, who exactly is observing and why they need this map? In the next stage, they try to pierce the screen not with their eyes, but with time. They use narrow windows when Venus shifts slightly, when conditions improve for seconds. It's a hunt for milliseconds. The logic is simple. If the object is really there, it must leave behind at least something it can't hide. And here's where the third, unpleasant layer emerges. In those rare moments when the window is slightly clearer, the trail appears, but it doesn't look like a comet cloud. It's too neat, too even in shape. And what's especially nasty, it doesn't always appear, but rather seems to appear on schedule. You usually expect the signal to strengthen when conditions improve. Here, improving conditions guarantees nothing. Sometimes you get emptiness. Sometimes you get subtle structure. It's as if the object chooses which windows to allow itself to be seen in and which to leave us to argue with each other in. The debate quickly becomes professionally heated. One group says these are light pollution artifacts, a classic feature of a bright planet. The second group replies, then why does the artifact sync with the Doppler deviations? The third group remains silent and simply assembles a coincidence matrix, because coincidences are the only thing that doesn't require faith. The matrix is formed like a blow to the table. Timestamps from radio networks, indirect atmospheric bursts, and rare, semi-visible traces begin to form a pattern. Not perfect, but recognizable. There are pauses in the pattern, as if the object is taking a step and waiting for a reaction. It's the word pause that evokes silence, because a pause isn't the physics of ice. A pause is a strategy. It's a behavior where not only the result is important, but also the observer's response. You take an action, observe what has changed, and adjust accordingly. At the same time, they're turning on something usually kept in the background, deep background catalogs. They're checking to see if the false trail matches known reflections, debris, or typical parasitic effects near Venus. And the more they check, the fewer convenient explanations remain, because parasitic effects should repeat themselves identically given the same configuration. But here, the configuration is almost identical, yet the effect appears selectively. And for some reason, this selectiveness coincides with the minutes when, according to calculations, the object should have passed through a certain sector. At this point, they are left with two options, both bad. First, admit it's a series of coincidences and move on. But then, they'll have to explain why there are so many coincidences and why they've been so cleverly placed in the right geometry. Second, accept that the object is using Venus as a conscious screen, and then the next phase will be even more unpleasant. Because if he knows how to choose his cover, he knows how to choose his moment, which means the next disappearance might not be due to Venus, but because he'll find an even more toxic zone for evidence, a zone where we'll forbid ourselves from looking. By the end of the day, a working hypothesis is formed, which is stated out loud without embellishment. He doesn't simply hide next to Venus. He uses Venus as a filter that filters out optical evidence, leaving only indirect signs that the public can use to prove nothing, and this turns the situation into a game of nerves. If you go public and say, "We're seeing strange coincidences," you'll be drowned out by the word light pollution. If you remain silent, the target will learn yet another lesson in how easy it is to manipulate the information field without touching a single satellite. Then a new message arrives, changing the tone of the conversation. One of the distant radio noise monitoring stations notes a brief episode of unusual signal stability amid the general chaos. It's as if someone is briefly straightening the profile to see if it's noticeable. It's too small to be a sensation, but it's enough for those who count coincidences to have a new point. And this point falls in the same place, in the Venusian sector, in the same time frame, in the same habit of the object to appear and disappear selectively. And now, the most troubling question isn't about Venus. It's about us. If an object can select zones where our instruments disagree, then it understands how we trust our data. And if it understands this, then it can not only hide, but also manipulate what we consider observable reality. That night, the decision was made quickly and without any fancy wording. If he was hiding in the Venusian light pollution, then we would stop hunting him head on and start hunting for his trail on Venus itself. The first step was to retrieve all available Venus data for the previous 24 hours, including those typically considered technical junk for calibration. They weren't looking for a comet, but for tiny, repeating defects in the scattered light. And almost immediately, something that's usually hidden under the word noise in beautiful pictures became apparent. In several independent series, the flare profile wasn't smooth, but had a thin, uniform notch that appeared at precisely the same moments. Normally, such an artifact would have been attributed to the optics, dust, or the sensor. But here, various instruments, different locations, and different commands coincided. Only one thing remained consistent: the Venus-Earth geometry, the sector where 3 Atlas should have been. NASA gave the command to parallel circuit. to connect not only astronomy but also communications. Deep space stations were put into operation where it is possible to measure not light, but the phase and stability of a radio link against a bright background. And then, the most unpleasant part began, because the radio link doesn't produce pictures, but it does produce numbers that are almost impossible to explain artistically. Several short intervals revealed a strangely regular phase jitter, as if someone were disturbing the medium between us and Venus. This tremor was too localized to be simply space weather. It came in bursts, at uniform rates, and then disappeared so abruptly as if someone had turned off a generator. At the same time, the optics again saw emptiness, as if on schedule. The most alarming thing happened in the morning when one of the operators posted a minute-by-minute coincidence on the table. The notch in Venus's profile, the radio phase, ring, and the indirect burst in the upper atmosphere coincided 3 times out of 3 within minutes. After that, the debate about whether it was really there ceased. The debate shifted to what exactly it was doing, if it needed to hide behind Venus, yet leave a repeating, almost demonstrative trace visible to multiple systems simultaneously. Someone said out loud what's usually left to one's own thoughts. This is a test. Not a test of our telescopes, but a test of our reactions. It's looking at how quickly we connect independent channels and where our weak points are, so we can target them with cover. A quiet, bureaucratic panic set in internally. Publications were delayed. For review, access to unpublished episodes was restricted to a select few, and emails were marked, "Do not forward." Publicly, however, everything appeared calm and orderly, and it's precisely against this backdrop of calm that something most frightening happens. One of the major archives suddenly updates its Venus observation reports, but without the usual preview files. Just metadata, just lines, as if someone had torn the eyes out of the report. Meanwhile, a brief incident erupts on the private side, initially ridiculed and then ignored. An amateur camera captures a strange thin line near Venus at the same time the professionals declare it impossible to observe. It's funny until a second amateur from another part of the world shows something similar. Not the same image, but the same geometry, the same characteristic break in the line, as if it weren't an object but a trace of its work in the light field. Then comes the dirty work, the hunt for the original source. Who took the photo first? What sensor? What optics? What settings? Was there a simple reflection? And the more thoroughly they check, the fewer reasons there are to dismiss it. Because there's no reason for the reflection to repeat in 2 places so synchronously, especially in the same interval where the radio line produces phase ringing. Too many different channels are intersecting at the same point in time. The internal plan is modified once again. If it uses Venus as a screen, then it's necessary to catch the moment when the screen ceases to be ideal. These are short windows, when the phase angle changes, when the light breathes slightly and the edge of the field is revealed for a few seconds, and under these windows they launch everything that can produce short bursts, fast bursts, narrow filters, and extremely strict exposure restrictions. In exchange, they get not beauty, but a fact. Over several bursts, a faint but persistent thickening appears near the edge of the Venusian halo. It doesn't look like a comet's tail, nor does it look like random haze. It looks like a structured region that holds its shape longer than any dust in such a geometry should. And the worst part? It only appears in the right windows. After this, a new version emerges in the conversation, and it sounds cold because it's logical. He's not simply hiding behind Venus. He's using its brightness as a mask, and within the mask, he's leaving marks to check whether we can see the difference between noise and signal. And then someone asks a question that breaks the silence. If he can choose his cover, why does he allow himself to be seen anywhere at all? The answer is simple and unpleasant, because visibility is also a tool if you control where and when you're seen. By evening, another detail comes to light. In one of the intervals, the radio line behaves as if an additional stable component appears for a few seconds, like a reflection from a denser structure than the gas cloud. The comet doesn't do this, but the technology does. This isn't proof of aliens, it's simply a characteristic of the signal that's hard to ignore. Internally, it's called the hard component. No one uses the word publicly because it's too well understood. After that, a new level of silence begins. Not press releases, not explanations, but a simple tactic, reducing the number of points where questions can be asked. The fewer people who see the raw data, the fewer people who ask uncomfortable questions. And right against this backdrop, a new twist occurs. The object suddenly shifts so that the Venusian screen is no longer ideal, but direct optics are still insufficient. It's as if it deliberately shifted from total blindness to half blindness to observe our second attempt. The internal conference becomes shorter and more intense. They're no longer arguing about what it is, but discussing what we'll do if he repeats this trick on another bright target. Because then, it won't be a one-time success, but a method. And at the end of the call, a suggestion was made that would normally be laughed at, but no one laughed. Watch our blind spots, not his. Draw up a map of where we're guaranteed to lose control and see if he'll choose those spots again. If he truly does read our restrictions, the next scene will be simple. He'll go where we ourselves forbid ourselves to look, and then all that'll remain are numbers, publication delays, and strange minute coincidences that will never be unseen. They thought they'd found a loophole. If Venus was acting as a screen, they needed to switch to a different wavelength, where brightness wouldn't kill contrast, and where an object couldn't be hidden by a simple glare. The plan was straightforward, not to capture an image, but to capture geometry. Not only telescopes were used, but also everything not usually associated with comets, deep space stations, communication satellites, even navigational constellations, because they have one advantage. They measure time and phase so precisely that any extra step in the signal is noticeable, and then something unpleasant happened. As soon as the team switched their observations to the off-optical contour, the object seemed to cease being just a spot somewhere near Venus. It began to behave like a point that selects reference beacons to which all our equipment is linked. The most boring systems were the first to be hit, those that people consider ideal because they always work. Stable links, reference frequencies, reference windows. In 2 intervals in a row, the phase noise jumped identically, as if someone had briefly tweaked the path. No one said it out loud right away because it sounded strange, but everyone in the room understood it in the same way. It's the feeling you get when you add a second reflective surface to a communication line, and a stable one at that. Not a cloud, not plasma, but something that holds its shape. The situation was complicated by the fact that the second hard component wasn't constant. It appeared and disappeared precisely when the Earth-Venus sector alignment formed a convenient angle. Not just sometimes, but rather according to a schedule that could be calculated. By evening, they were already drawing not one trajectory, but 2. The first was the official one, where the object should be as a celestial body. The second was the working one, where it should be if it pauses to check with our beacons and lines. And the second curve looked even more vile because there was no randomness to it. It didn't cut through space like a stone, but moved as if it were choosing the points from which it would be easiest for us to measure, as if it were deliberately positioning itself for our rulers. Then they brought up an old idea, usually used for calibrating instruments, not for hunting. Compare not absolute data, but the discrepancies between independent systems. If an object interferes, it will leave a signature in the discrepancy between the standards. At that moment, a small 3-line printout landed on the table. It showed a difference in the clocks at 2 stations, each minute different. Nothing dramatic for the average person, but for an engineer, it was like a fingerprint, right where the notch on Venus is. They returned to Venus again, but differently. Not as a screen, but as a test surface. If an object is nearby and working with the field, then the light halo should show microscopic, repeatable distortions. Not noise, but structure, and a structure appeared. Not a beautiful line, not a bright dot, but a subtle asymmetry in the diffuse light, flickering in short bursts. The most terrifying thing was that the burst matched the pitch of that very same phased ringing in the radio circuit. After the third coincidence, the argument ended. Internally, they stopped calling it difficult geometry. It became active cover. That is, it's not that we're seeing poorly, but that we're being allowed to see just enough so we waste time and limit ourselves. Then NASA adopted the most unpleasant word of the day, countermeasures. Not in the military sense, but in the scientific one. Stop publishing beautiful images. Stop scheduling observations under familiar windows. Stop broadcasting schedules. Make it so the object has nothing to read. And it was at this moment that the object made a move that seemed almost mocking. It shifted so that Venus no longer completely obscured it, but any direct shot was once again on the verge of being overexposed. A semi-blindness, perfectly level, as if perfectly adjusted. It seemed as if he wasn't simply hiding, but keeping us in a state of constant uncertainty, so that we'd never get a final shot, but always get enough crumbs to construct theories and bounce between them. Next came the second level. They decided to test what would happen if they looked not where they were expected, but where they shouldn't. They would introduce a false window into the closed circuit, plan observations as bait, and never actually launch them. The results arrived a few hours later, and they were too clear. During the interval that looked like an active window in the correspondence and graphs, a phase step reappeared on one of the systems, even though there was no actual observation. This meant that the instruments weren't responding. It was the first moment when someone in the room said quietly and very evenly, "He's responding to our coordination." Not to light, not to gravity, but to the very fact that we were building a network and beginning to act in concert as a single organism. After this, a new clause was added to the protocol, limit coherence. That is, deliberately ensuring that different teams work in isolation, without a common grid, without a common time, without a common tempo. If an object seeks synchronicity, it must be killed. And then the hardest part began, because that's not how science works. Science relies on data being compared, people checking, everything matching up, and now they were being asked to deliberately break the mechanism to see if someone was using it against them. From the outside, everything continued to look calm. Venus was just Venus. The comet was just a comet. Routine observations, occasional comments. But inside, they were already talking about something else. If he was so confidently using Venus as cover, then he had another screen. And the next screen doesn't even need to be looked for. It's obvious. Jupiter with its radiation and noise, or the sun with its light pollution, or the moon with its geometry, where half the instruments are forced to remain silent. The question wasn't whether he can, but when he'll do it again. The worst part was that logic suggested a simple answer. He'll repeat it exactly when we're ready. Because the point of a cover-up isn't to disappear forever, but to control the moment of reappearance. Let us see enough to believe, and then take away the most important thing. And with this thought, they came up against reality. They had one window left where they could intercept beyond the Venusian halo, but it required the coordination of 4 major observatories and 2 space platforms. That is, precisely what he reads best. The window was narrow and capricious, not because of bad conditions, but because the geometry finally offered a chance to pull the object out of the Venusian glare without relying on a single instrument. If even one eye made a mistake, the others would have to confirm it. That's why the plan seemed strange even to them. Not a single megasession accompanied by applause, but 4 independent lines, each unaware of the details of the other. One looks at the edge of the halo, another at the empty field nearby, the third takes the spectrum, and the fourth remains silent and only writes down the timing. It was like an ambush for the person reading the schedule. If they reacted to our synchronicity, they couldn't be shown synchronicity. And so the schedule was torn up, the observation times were separated, the formats were changed. Even the wording in the correspondence was changed. The most nerve-wracking moment didn't start at the launch, but an hour before. A familiar phase, step, appeared again in the logs of one of the deep space stations, as if someone had touched the line, checking if it was alive. At that point, the optics hadn't even opened the dome yet. This was a bad sign for a simple reason. He was already sniffing the circuit, even when the circuit wasn't working. This meant he wasn't waiting for our photographs. He was waiting for our intentions, our connections, our attempts to become a unified observer. Then they did something they never usually do. They activated a false signal on one communication channel, just to see who would react. No telescopes, no lights, just the supposed launch of the protocol. The answer came 9 minutes later, and it was too precise. A secondary reflection appeared in the radio data with an identical delay, as if someone had placed a flat surface nearby and briefly rotated it. Not noise, not plasma, geometry that held. The most frustrating thing was that the delay coincided with the sector where, according to calculations, the object should have passed if it remained beyond Venus, but made a slight lateral correction to remain within the optical dead zone. In other words, it was where it benefited. And here, for the first time, they admitted the idea they usually dismiss for fear of going crazy. That Venus wasn't just a cover for him, but a working point, like an anchor. As if he were using it not for camouflage, but to precisely pinpoint his route. The main session began. The first observatory captured the field at the edge of the Venusian halo with short exposures, capturing not the object but its influence on the background. The second observatory operated in a different range, where scattering should behave predictably. The third platform didn't take pictures in the traditional sense. It ran the spectrum and looked for an extra narrow line in the halo, as if someone were adding radiation that shouldn't be there. The fourth simply recorded the timing of events. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened, and that was worse than if it had, because at that level of tension, the emptiness always feels like the pause before the punch. The team spoke briefly and without emotion, as if emotion would ruin the signal. Then it hit 2 at once. At the first observatory, the background at the edge of the halo shifted in a thin wave, as if a weak lens had appeared in the field for a second. At the second observatory, a repeating dip appeared in the data, too uniform to be the atmosphere. They checked the mundane. Guidance, mechanics, dome shaking, temperature drifts. Nothing matched, too clean, too short, too synchronous in form. And most importantly, it happened not at the peak of observation, but on the approach. Then the third platform produced something that silenced everyone. A thin line appeared in the spectrum, lasting exactly 3 minutes before disappearing. It wasn't in the location typical of cometary signatures, and it was too consistent in width. The line looked like man-made radiation when it's accidentally detected in radio astronomy, narrow, stubborn, unlike a natural mixture. But it wasn't radio, and it wasn't somewhere far away. It was within the Venusian halo, and at precisely that moment, what was later called the second series false star occurred. In the first observatory's frames, at the limit of sensitivity, a point source appeared. It wasn't bright. It was simply too perfect in profile. Comets don't produce a point-like profile. Comets are a coma, a tail, dirt, asymmetry. But here was a point, like a star, but not a star, because it sat in a place where catalogs say it's empty, and it held relative to the object's presumed position. The dot lasted for 8 minutes. It didn't flicker, didn't blur, didn't float across the field like a satellite. It seemed to stand on a rail, tethered to something moving behind Venus, and then vanished as abruptly as it had appeared. The fourth line, timing, was the final nail in the coffin. The disappearance of the star coincided, seconds by second, with the disappearance of the secondary reflection in the radio circuit. It was too perfect to be a coincidence of different instruments and different physical processes. It was here, inside, that it became clear they had captured not an object, but its mode. It wasn't manifesting as a body. It was manifesting as a function, a brief beacon, a brief signature, a brief geometry, as if it were turning something on to test our reaction. And the reaction was predictable. Everyone wanted to repeat it. Everyone wanted to amplify it. Everyone wanted to link the data into a single array. And that was precisely what couldn't be done. Because if he was truly reading our connectivity, he would take the next step preemptively. So the solution seemed cruel. They prohibited real-time merging. Data was stored in blind batches so that no one on site could see the whole picture. Each team thought it had a local quirk, and only later would everything be consolidated. This measure might have seemed paranoid, but it worked. Because when you don't have a common nerve center, it's harder to find you. And they already felt themselves being probed, like a network being tested, where it trembled, where it responded, where it became frightened. An hour later, the object made a second pass with Venus. The halo again became dense to optical observations, but a different line suddenly appeared in the spectrum, weaker but longer. It was as if it had changed transmission modes. At the same time, the radio signal was reflected again, but with a different delay. It was like a person adjusting an antenna when they see they're being picked up. They change the frequency, change the pulse duration, change the pattern. A random rock doesn't do that, and even natural plasma doesn't do that consistently. Then the most vile hypothesis of the day surfaced, that a false star isn't a nearby satellite or a glint. It's an active point, intentionally created as a reference point, either to orient the object itself or to orient someone within it. And if it is a beacon, it can be directional. That is, we don't always see it, but only when we're in the right sector. It appears not because it's feeling bad, but because it chooses who and when to let see a piece of the truth. At this point, NASA once again hit a dead end that couldn't be circumvented by technical means. To prove this, a repeat is needed. But repetition requires coordination, and coordination is what he apparently uses as a signal. And yet, they decided on a third attempt. This time, it was less like a hunt and more like a provocation. They would pretend to go one way, but in reality, they would go another. They would prepare a showcase for the target and a hidden interception for themselves. They did something they usually only do during military exercises. They set up a display window. Officially, there was one observation window, beautifully painted with a clear purpose. Unofficially, there were two hidden windows, not visible anywhere. The display case was a decoy. They pointed telescopes, which were still in plain sight, at it and let them operate according to standard protocol, as if everyone knew the object was hiding in the Venusian light pollution exactly where they were waiting. Hidden windows were a different matter. One sector was shifted by a few arc minutes, to a point where there's no point. The second was pushed into a range generally considered useless due to background effects. The meaning was simple and cruel. If a false star appears in response to our intention, it must flash in the display case. But if the true signal exists independently of our performance, it will manifest itself where we are not acting. For the first 40 minutes, the display case was silent. Zero action, a flat background, neat shots, and this even reassured those who didn't know about the hidden windows. They began to think, okay, just heavy geometry. And then the display case delivered exactly what they expected. A dot flared at the edge of the halo, almost in the perfect spot where it could most easily be sold as a rare star or a buzz. 8 minutes of stability, and then vanishing. At that moment, the people in the hidden channels didn't even twitch, because almost simultaneously another trace appeared in the first hidden window. Not a dot, not a coma, but a thin arc, as if someone had slightly bent the background. The arc lasted less than a minute, but it repeated twice at the same interval. It looked as if a scan had passed through the field like a sweep line, each time touching the same area. The second hidden window yielded the most unpleasant part. A narrow line appeared in the spectrum, but not where it had been before. It seemed to have moved to the adjacent channel, adjusting to our filters. This was no longer a coincidence. It was behavior. The bait worked, but the subject didn't simply show a beacon. He simultaneously did real work elsewhere, and he did it in such a way that we understood. For him, the display case was transparent. After that, there was a pause that made everyone's insides go cold. A short response pulse came through the radio circuit like an acknowledgement of receipt, not noise, not a reflection. A response. No one mentioned the word contact, but everyone understood that this was precisely the kind of thing they couldn't even whisper about. There were too many people, too many lines of communication, and any rumor would quickly become a leak. And the leak didn't originate with NASA. It originated with private individuals who weren't even part of the system. Amateur observers suddenly experienced a strange synchronicity. Two people in different countries described the same star point near an object. The worst thing is that they described the same detail. The dot did not appear in the center of their field, but always shifted in the same direction, as if it were not an object in the sky, but a mark relative to another body. It was at this point that the task force switched to a mode that looks like cowardice, but is in fact the only way to avoid defeat. They began blocking access to publications, delaying raw footage, and closing empty windows. Publicly, this was easily explained. Complex illumination, calibration, and data verification. These words always work because they sound boring, and boredom is the best screen for panic. Inside, it became clear. The object was using Venus as a curtain, but not just to hide. It was using it as a geometric filter to select who and what could be seen. If you look from the right place and at the right moment, it gives you a point. If you look wrong, it gives you a background distortion. If you try to generalize, it changes the spectrum line. This logic seemed almost mocking, as if he were testing people, not telescopes. Who would repeat? Who would coordinate? Who would run to social media? Who would shut up and start building models? And then they took an even riskier step. They broke their own discipline for a day and gave one small group access to the whole picture, without delays or filters. They needed one thing, to understand what connected all the manifestations. The beacon, the arc, the spectral line, and the radio pulse. If they had a common rhythm, then there was a common mechanism. The rhythm was quickly found, and that was worse than no rhythm at all. The interval matched the geometry beyond Venus, and the very same shift that amateurs had recorded in their footage. To put it simply, the dot flashed not when it was convenient for us, but when the object passed through a specific phase of its relative Earth-Venus position. It's as if it weren't a flash, but rather an antenna orientation. If it's an antenna, the false star isn't near the object, it's on it. It's part of a system that briefly projects a highly focused signal and then closes back in. And that explained the strangest thing, why the dot disappears abruptly without fading smoothly. Because it's not the light of a comet, it's an on-off switch, like a key. After that, silence fell again. But this time it wasn't technical, but administrative. Observation windows were suddenly clarified. Schedules were rescheduled. Several teams were ordered not to expand their comments. Then something happened that in normal reality would seem like a coincidence, but here, like a continuation of the game. The load on the data exchange system increased for 2 hours, as if someone from the outside were trying to find our most sensitive nodes. The network didn't crash, it simply floated, just enough to make actual integration impossible, while the showcase footage continued to flow without issue. It looked as if someone had a knack for applying pressure to the right areas, and then they faced the most unpleasant choice: either continue the performance and wait for new flashes, risking losing the real trail, or turn off the display case and admit he's reacting, which means he's seeing. They chose the third option. They kept the display case, but changed the meaning of the hidden windows. Now they weren't trying to catch the body, they were trying to capture the protocol, how the subject chooses what they know to show, and to whom. The next step was clear and terrifying. Create too many observers in the display case. Show the subject that everyone is looking here. And at the same time, in silence, check whether they'll move elsewhere. If he leaves, it means he's avoiding the mass gaze. If he stays, it means he's using the mass gaze as a resource, as a stimulus, as a test of the planet's reaction. There will be a moment when the showcase will become a trap for us. A third flash of the false star will appear, but with a different shade in the spectrum, and it is after this that strange failures will begin in atmospheric observation satellites. The third flash happened not when it became visible, but when it became inconvenient. The object was still held in Venusian geometry, but the dot lit up against a background that even professionals usually attribute to light pollution and artifacts. The difference was in the color, not in a poetic sense, but in the data. The peak had shifted, the line had become narrower, and the profile seemed to have been cut at the edges. Such a trace is left not by a comet, but by a source that knows how to dose its signal. Almost immediately afterward, weather satellite reports landed on the table. Not a storm, not a magnetic storm, not a general background. A narrow band of disturbances in the upper atmosphere crossed the map as if someone had drawn a ruler across it. The most disturbing thing was the geometry. The stripe coincided with the Earth object direction at the very moment the false star reappeared near its halo. Not a coincidence in perception, but a coincidence in timing and azimuths. No one inside disputed that this could be explained by random fluctuations. The dispute was about something else. If this was a test of the atmosphere's reaction, then the object wasn't simply hiding behind Venus, it was using Earth as a measuring rig. NASA again chose boring wording. The public logs included the words local data anomaly and calibration reassessment. To the outside world, it sounded like routine technicality, and that's precisely why it worked. But inside, the voices were telling a different story. For the first time in the entire cycle, someone said not anomaly, but feedback. Because the atmosphere wasn't just noisy, it was noisy, as if it were being touched and awaiting a response. Then something happened that made their ears burn. A request came through one of the closed channels from the radar's military segment. Do you have confirmation of a stable reflection in this sector? The phrase was dry, almost emotionless. But the meaning was heavier than any shout. A stable mark isn't dust or a tail. It's something that holds its shape, produces a repeatable signal, and doesn't fall apart due to dissipation patterns. 10 minutes later, access to several archives was accidentally restricted. Publications continued to appear on the showcase, but raw files with metadata began disappearing from the chain, as if they had never existed. And then an amateur layer emerged that couldn't be silenced by a command. A short post appeared on the forums. Has anyone else seen a dot at the same offset? Mine is relative to the comet, not the stars. The post didn't last long. It was quickly drowned in sarcasm and memes, but screenshots had already circulated. And the worst part was that the original files were attached to the screenshots, which contained an honest star alignment. The teams monitoring the leaks didn't panic. They did something different. They tracked where exactly the shift was repeated and compared it with what professional instruments were seeing in hidden windows. The grid matched. This meant that the false star didn't flare up nearby at random. It flared up in a specific orientation, and even those not involved in the coordination could see it. In other words, the object wasn't simply responding to attention, it was executing a cycle. At this point, they stopped thinking in terms of capturing a frame. They started thinking in terms of reading the protocol. If a system has a step, a period, and a trigger condition, then it's possible to predict the next act. The next act began with a silence no one expected. The display case produced perfect, clean frames, so clean that they looked unbelievably smooth, as if the subject had deliberately calmed with the image. But in the hidden window, at the same hour, the opposite happened. The background floated slightly along the edge of the field, as if a structure that does not glow, but affects the passage of light and radio waves, entered the frame for a split second. The most frightening thing, the effect repeated itself at the same interval, and each time it occurred at a precise angle when the Earth-Venus object line coincided. It wasn't a spectacle, but a precise adjustment, like an instrument. Then one of the elders said something simple, without drama. He's not using Venus to hide. He's using Venus to filter who sees what, and to keep us from lumping everything together. After that, a decision was made that is usually made only once in a lifetime. They launched a false coordination. They pretended the entire world was focused on one sector, but the real instruments were deployed in another. If the object responds to the intent, it should display a false star in the display case. If it runs its program independently, it will continue the loop where it needs to, and then will catch the real trail. The display case received a flash almost immediately. Beautiful, convenient, like a textbook example. A couple of minutes of stability, then a shutdown. The crowd of onlookers would have received a sensation, but inside it was already perceived as a mechanical trick. But the real trace came in another sector, not a dot, but a series of short radio pulses, so regular that they couldn't be dismissed as random. They felt like confirmation, as if the system were registering the completion of a step. And it was precisely after this episode that the upper atmosphere twitched again. Not universally, not in a storm, but in a thin band. Moreover, the band was positioned slightly differently, as if someone were changing the angle of the impact and observing how the response changed. Here, for the first time, they had the feeling that this wasn't about danger in the everyday sense. This was about an experiment. The Earth in this experiment wasn't a target to be struck. The Earth was the object of measurement. The atmosphere was the layer that was easiest to touch. The most troubling question was never asked out loud, but it hung in the air. If this is atmospheric calibration, then what will be the next layer? The ionosphere, the magnetosphere, the radio belts, communications, navigation, everything that sustains civilization. So they did one more thing, which sounds small but makes a big difference. They asked several independent groups in different countries to observe not the object, but the background next to it, in identical modes, without advertising the target. And then, something hard to forget surfaced. In two places at once, the background created the same hole for seconds. Not a black pixel, but a dip in photon statistics. As if something in the line of sight had swallowed up the light, leaving no trace. When you see something like this once, you doubt yourself. When it comes synchronously from 2 points, the doubt changes its address. You begin to doubt not the device, but the nature of what you're looking at. The story will then go like this. The object will either secure the Venusian curtain and begin to put more pressure on our data exchange, or it will make a more subtle move and go into lunar geometry, where it can hide the phase and disrupt scheduled observations.